10 deadliest and bloodiest leaders in history. 1. Joseph Stalin, Soviet Union, 1924 to 1953. Born on December 18, 1878, into a poor Georgian family in Gori, Georgia, which was part of the Russian Empire, Joseph Stalin, born Yosif Vissarionovich Jugashvili, grew up in poverty and had an abusive father. He attended a seminary where he was introduced to Marxist ideology, leading him to join revolutionary activities against the Tsarist regime. He later adopted the name Stalin, meaning man of steel. Joseph Stalin's journey to power began in the early 20th century when he became an active Bolshevik revolutionary. Aligned with Vladimir Lenin, he participated in the 1905 and 1917 revolutions, playing a critical role in financing the Bolshevik cause through bank robberies and extortion. His reputation as a ruthless and committed revolutionary helped him rise through the ranks of the Communist Party. In 1922, Stalin was appointed General Secretary of the party, a role that appeared insignificant at the time, but provided him with the ability to control key party appointments. Through careful maneuvering, he used this position to build a network of loyalists, strengthening his grip on power. Following Lenin's death in 1924, Stalin wasted no time in eliminating his political rivals. Using a combination of manipulation, strategic alliances, and brutal purges, he systematically outmaneuvered figures like Leon Trotsky, Lev Kamenev, Nikolai Bukharin, and Grigory Zinoviev. By the late 1920s, his dominance was absolute. Having crushed all opposition, Stalin emerged as the unchallenged leader of the Soviet Union, setting the stage for a reign marked by terror, repression, and immense political control. Stalin's wicked acts. The Great Purge, 1936 to 1938. The Great Terror, one of Stalin's most infamous atrocities, involved mass executions and imprisonments. Secondly, he orchestrated show trials against former Bolshevik leaders, forcing them to confess to false crimes before executing them. Stalin ordered the execution and imprisonment of millions of civilians, party members, intellectuals, and military officers. Also, Stalin ordered the execution and imprisonment of millions of civilians, party members, intellectuals, and military officers. An estimated 750,000 to 1.2 million were executed, while millions more were sent to labor camps or disappeared. One of Stalin's deadliest policies was the forced collectivization of agriculture, leading to mass starvation, particularly in Ukraine. Stalin forced millions of peasants into collective farms, seizing grain and livestock. The Soviet government requisitioned food for export, leaving the local population to starve. Millions of Ukrainians, Kazakhs, and other ethnic groups perished. Stalin denied the famine's existence, prevented foreign aid, and punished those who spoke out. Estimates of the death toll range from 3.5 to 7 million people, with some historians labeling it genocide. Gulags and mass repressions. The Gulag system was a vast network of forced labor camps that became a hallmark of Stalin's rule. Millions of prisoners were sent to remote Siberian camps, where they performed backbreaking labor in mines, railroads, and logging camps. Conditions were brutal. Prisoners faced starvation, freezing temperatures, disease, and executions. Prisoners included political dissidents, suspected spies, criminals, and innocent civilians. The death toll in the gulags is estimated to be 1.5 to 2 million, though millions more suffered there. World War II and brutality, 1939 to 1945. Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, 1939. Stalin signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler, allowing Nazi Germany to invade Poland while the Soviet Union occupied eastern Poland, the Baltics, and parts of Finland. After Germany attacked the USSR in 1941, Stalin was caught off guard, leading to massive Soviet losses. Brutality during the war. Stalin implemented a scorched earth policy, instructing his troops to destroy Soviet infrastructure and food supplies to keep them from falling into Nazi hands, which further intensified civilian suffering. Stalin ordered the execution of thousands of Soviet officers and soldiers for retreating or surrendering. Stalin forcibly deported suspected traitor ethnic groups, including Chechens, Crimean Tatars, and Volga Germans, to Siberia and Central Asia, resulting in mass deaths. Post-war Soviet expansion and oppression, 1945 to 1953. After World War II, Stalin enforced a harsh communist regime across Eastern Europe, establishing the Iron Curtain. Soviet forces occupied Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria, installing puppet communist governments. Dissenters were imprisoned, executed, or exiled. Driven by espionage and paranoia, Stalin carried out political purges throughout the Eastern Bloc to maintain Soviet dominance. The Berlin Blockade, 1948-1949, was a strategic attempt to cut off West Berlin supplies and force it into submission, prompting the Western Allies to launch an airlift in response. Stalin's death and legacy. On March 1, 1953, Stalin suffered a stroke, but his guards hesitated to enter his room out of fear. After hours of agony, he passed away on March 5, 1953. His death set off a power struggle that ultimately led to Nikita Khrushchev's rise and the beginning of de-Stalinization. While some Russians still praise him for industrialization and the Soviet victory in World War II, historians overwhelmingly regard him as one of history's most ruthless dictators. 2. Adolf Hitler. Germany, 1933 to 1945. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, Austria-Hungary, near the German border. His father, Alois Hitler, was a strict customs official, while his mother, Clara Hitler, was devoted and overprotective. During his school years, Hitler was rebellious, performed poorly academically, and showed little interest in formal education. He aspired to become an artist, but was rejected twice by the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts in 1907 and 1908. From 1909 to 1913, he lived in poverty in Vienna, often staying in homeless shelters and struggling to make ends meet. During this period, he absorbed extremist ideologies, developing strong anti-Semitic, nationalist, and anti-Marxist beliefs under the influence of far-right thinkers. In 1913, he moved to Munich, Germany, in part to evade Austrian military service. World War I experience, 1914 to 1918. Hitler eagerly enlisted in the German army at the start of World War I in 1914. He served as a courier on the Western Front, delivering messages between frontline positions. Despite being awarded the Iron Cross, first and second class for bravery, he was never promoted beyond corporal. In 1918, he was temporarily blinded in a gas attack and spent time recovering in a military hospital. Germany's defeat left him bitter, as he embraced the belief that the nation had been stabbed in the back by Jews, socialists, and politicians. The Treaty of Versailles, 1919, which imposed severe penalties on Germany, intensified Hitler's hatred and desire for revenge. The Nazi Party and Hitler's rise, 1919 to 1933. In 1919, Hitler joined the German Workers' Party, DAP, which later became the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, or Nazi Party. He quickly rose to leadership through his charismatic speeches and mastery of propaganda. Hitler shaped Nazi ideology around extreme nationalism, anti-Semitism, anti-communism, and militarism. He established the SA, Sturmabteilung, or Brown Shirts, a paramilitary force that violently targeted political opponents. In 1923, he led the Beer Hall Putsch, a failed coup attempt against the Weimar Republic. Arrested and imprisoned, he wrote Mein Kampf, outlining his vision of Aryan supremacy and expansionism. After his release, he legally rebuilt the Nazi Party, using propaganda, mass rallies, and fear tactics to expand its influence. He capitalized on the Great Depression, 1929, which caused mass unemployment to gain widespread public support. By 1932, the Nazi Party had become the largest faction in the Reichstag. January 30, 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Hitler as Chancellor. On February 27, 1933, Reichstag fire allowed Hitler to crush opposition and suspend civil liberties. On March 23, 1933, Enabling Act gave Hitler absolute power, making him dictator of Germany. Hitler's wicked acts. 1. The Holocaust, a genocide of unprecedented scale. Hitler's ideology saw Jews, Slavs, Romani people, disabled individuals, and others as inferior. Nuremberg Laws, 1935, stripped Jews of citizenship and banned intermarriage with Germans. Kristallnacht, 1938. A state-sponsored pogrom destroyed Jewish businesses and synagogues. Final Solution, 1941 to 1945. Ghettos. Jews were confined in horrific conditions. Warsaw Ghetto, etc. Concentration camps. Prisoners were forced into brutal labor, starvation, and mass executions. Extermination camps. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, etc. used gas chambers to kill millions. Over 6 million Jews murdered, plus millions of Poles, Romani people, disabled individuals, LGBTQ+ people, and political dissidents. World War II, global conflict and war crimes. In 1936, Hitler boldly defied the Treaty of Versailles by remilitarizing the Rhineland, testing the resolve of Britain and France. 2 years later, in 1938, he orchestrated the Anschluss, annexing Austria without facing any resistance. That same year, in what became a symbol of failed appeasement, Britain and France signed the Munich Agreement, allowing Hitler to seize the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia in hopes of avoiding war. However, these concessions only emboldened him further, bringing Europe closer to the brink of conflict. On March 1939, Hitler invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, despite promises. On September 1, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, leading Britain and France to declare war. World War II begins. Hitler's major battles and war crimes. With the outbreak of World War II, Hitler unleashed Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, rapidly overwhelming Poland in 1939 before turning his forces against Western Europe. By mid-1940, France had fallen, and much of Europe lay under Nazi control. Seeking to break British resistance, Hitler launched the Battle of Britain, ordering the Luftwaffe to relentlessly bomb London during the Blitz, killing thousands. Yet, Britain stood firm. In 1941, Hitler betrayed his uneasy pact with the Soviet Union and launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. As Nazi forces advanced, they laid siege to Leningrad, where over 1 million civilians perished from starvation under Hitler's ruthless blockade. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, Nazi Einsatzgruppen death squads carried out horrific massacres, executing millions of Jews, Soviet POWs, and civilians. That same year, after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, Hitler declared war on the United States, a decision that would seal Germany's fate and ultimately lead to the downfall of the Nazi regime. Hitler's military failures and downfall. As World War II progressed, Adolf Hitler's military ambitions began to unravel. The turning point came with the Battle of Stalingrad, 1942-1943, where the Soviet Red Army delivered a crushing defeat to Nazi forces, marking the beginning of Germany's decline. On June 6, 1944, the Allies launched the D-Day invasion, storming the beaches of Normandy and breaking through Nazi-occupied France. As pressure mounted on multiple fronts, Hitler grew increasingly paranoid, taking direct control over military strategy. His erratic decision-making and refusal to listen to his generals led to a series of catastrophic defeats. Desperation within the German ranks culminated in an assassination attempt on July 20, 1944, when a group of German officers planted a bomb at his headquarters. Though he survived, his trust in his inner circle shattered, leading to further instability. By January 1945, Soviet forces had entered Germany, closing in on Berlin. With defeat imminent, Hitler retreated to his underground bunker. On April 30, 1945, as Soviet troops advanced through the city, he and Eva Braun took their own lives in the Führer bunker, bringing his reign to a violent end. Pol Pot, Cambodia, 1975 to 1979. Born as Saloth Sar in 1925, Pol Pot grew up in a rural Cambodian village in a relatively privileged family. As a young man, he traveled to France for education, where he was introduced to communist ideology and became involved in Marxist circles. Inspired by Maoist principles, he embraced the idea of a classless, agrarian society and returned to Cambodia in the early 1950s. Upon his return, Pol Pot joined the underground Communist Party of Kampuchea, Khmer Rouge, and gradually rose through its ranks. In the following years, Cambodia was caught in growing instability, with the Vietnam War spilling over its borders. The U.S. bombed Cambodian territory to weaken North Vietnamese forces hiding there, inadvertently fueling resentment and pushing many rural Cambodians toward the Khmer Rouge. By the late 1960s, Pol Pot had become the Khmer Rouge's leader, orchestrating a growing insurgency against the U.S.-backed Cambodian government. Civil war raged for years, weakening the government's hold on the country. On April 17, 1975, the Khmer Rouge forces marched into Phnom Penh, seizing the capital and toppling the government. As Pol Pot took power, Cambodians cheered, believing peace had finally arrived. But instead of rebuilding the nation, he embarked on one of history's deadliest social experiments, transforming Cambodia into a radical agrarian society at an unimaginable human cost. Pol Pot's wicked acts. Once in power, Pol Pot unleashed one of the most brutal regimes in modern history, determined to reshape Cambodia into a radical agrarian society. Inspired by Maoist ideals, he sought to erase all traces of modernity, intellectualism, and foreign influence, enforcing his vision with ruthless violence. His regime evacuated cities overnight, forcing millions of Cambodians into the countryside to work in collective farms. Families were torn apart, and city dwellers, labeled as new people, were subjected to starvation, forced labor, and brutal executions. Schools, hospitals, and factories were abandoned, as Cambodia was thrust back into what Pol Pot called Year Zero. To eliminate perceived enemies, his forces, known as the Khmer Rouge, launched mass purges. Intellectuals, teachers, doctors, and even those who simply wore glasses were branded as threats and executed. The infamous tool slang, S21 prison, became a symbol of terror, where thousands were tortured into false confessions before being sent to the killing fields, where they were executed and buried in mass graves. Under his rule, religion was outlawed, with Buddhist monks slaughtered and temples destroyed. Ethnic minorities, including Chinese, Vietnamese, and Cham Muslims, were targeted for extermination, leading to widespread massacres. By the time the Khmer Rouge was overthrown in 1979, nearly 2 million Cambodians, about a quarter of the population, had perished from starvation, forced labor, disease, and execution. Pol Pot's 4-year reign of terror left Cambodia in ruins, a nation haunted by its past and struggling to recover from one of the worst genocides of the 20th century. Pol Pot's death and legacy. After the fall of the Khmer Rouge in 1979, Pol Pot fled into the Cambodian jungle, where he remained in hiding for nearly 2 decades. Protected by loyal Khmer Rouge fighters, he evaded capture and continued to lead a weakened insurgency against the new Cambodian government. By the 1990s, his movement had crumbled, and former allies turned against him. In 1997, he was arrested by his own Khmer Rouge commanders and placed under house arrest in a remote jungle camp. Isolated and in failing health, Pol Pot died on April 15, 1998, reportedly from heart failure, though some suspect he was poisoned to prevent him from being brought to justice. Mao Zedong, China, 1949 to 1976. Mao Zedong was born on December 26, 1893, in Shaoshan, Hunan Province, China, into a prosperous peasant family. Despite his privileged upbringing, he rebelled against the strict Confucian traditions imposed by his father, seeking a different path in life. As he grew older, Mao became deeply fascinated by political philosophy, particularly the revolutionary ideas of Karl Marx and Sun Yat-sen, which challenged the old order and inspired visions of a new China. In 1911, as China stood on the brink of change, he supported the revolution that led to the collapse of the Qing dynasty and the birth of the Chinese Republic. This pivotal moment ignited his passion for political transformation. His time at Hunan First Normal University proved to be another turning point. Surrounded by intellectual debate and radical thought, Mao's political beliefs intensified, setting him on the path to becoming one of the most influential and controversial figures in modern Chinese history. Mao's early political journey. In 1919, Mao Zedong became actively involved in the May 4th movement, a wave of nationalist student protests against foreign domination and China's weak government. This movement deepened his revolutionary convictions, fueling his desire for radical change. By 1921, Mao had taken a decisive step toward his vision for China, becoming one of the founding members of the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. He quickly emerged as a key figure, advocating for a communist revolution that would reshape the nation. During the mid-1920s, the CCP briefly allied with the Kuomintang KMT nationalists to unite China. However, in 1927, the fragile partnership shattered when Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the KMT, turned against the communists, launching mass purges and violent crackdowns. Thousands of communists were imprisoned or executed, forcing Mao to rethink his strategy. Rather than continuing the struggle in the cities, Mao retreated to the countryside, realizing that China's vast peasant population, not urban workers, held the key to revolution. This shift in focus would later define his approach to communist warfare and shape the course of modern Chinese history. The Long March, the Civil War, and the birth of Communist China, 1934 to 1949. By 1934, Mao Zedong faced a dire situation. Under relentless attacks from Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces, the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, was forced into a desperate retreat. Mao led his followers on the Long March, an excruciating 6,000-mile journey through treacherous mountains, rivers, and swamps. Of the 86,000 communists who began the march, only 8,000 survived the brutal conditions and constant battles. Despite the immense losses, the Long March proved to be a defining moment for Mao. By the time he and his followers reached Yan'an, he had secured complete control over the CCP, cementing his leadership and reshaping the party's strategy. As World War II erupted in 1937, Japan invaded China, forcing the bitter rivals, the CCP and the Kuomintang KMT, into a temporary alliance against a common enemy. However, after Japan's surrender in 1945, the fragile truce collapsed, and China was plunged into civil war once again. For 4 years, Mao's communist forces waged a relentless campaign against Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists. By 1949, Mao emerged victorious. On October 1, 1949, he proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China, PRC, marking the dawn of communist rule. Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan, where the Republic of China, ROC, still exists today, while Mao prepared to reshape China under his rule. Mao's wicked acts. Determined to rapidly transform China into a global industrial power, Mao Zedong launched the Great Leap Forward in 1958, an ambitious plan that would become one of the deadliest policies in history. Mao envisioned a nation where collective farming and mass steel production would propel China forward. Farmers were forced into large communes, where private land ownership was abolished, and strict quotas were imposed. Villagers were ordered to build backyard furnaces, melting down household metal in a futile attempt to produce steel, diverting labor away from agriculture. However, the plan quickly spiraled into disaster. With millions of peasants pulled from the fields, food production collapsed. At the same time, local officials, fearing punishment, falsely reported record grain harvests, leading the government to seize massive amounts of food, believing there was a surplus. In reality, the countryside was starving. As famine swept across China, those caught hiding food were brutally punished. Villages descended into desperation, with reports of cannibalism and mass death. By the time the Great Leap Forward ended in 1962, an estimated 45 million people had perished, the deadliest famine in human history, leaving an indelible scar on China. By the time the Great Leap Forward ended in 1962, the consequences were catastrophic. An estimated 45 million people perished, not just from starvation, but also from overwork, brutal punishments, and executions. Entire villages were wiped out, and desperate survivors resorted to unimaginable means to stay alive. Despite mounting evidence of the unfolding disaster, Mao Zedong refused to acknowledge the famine, dismissing reports of mass starvation as bourgeois lies. His unwavering commitment to his vision led to one of the deadliest man-made catastrophes in history. Fearing he was losing power within the Communist Party, Mao launched the Cultural Revolution in 1966, a violent political purge aimed at eradicating so-called bourgeois influences and reaffirming his control. He mobilized millions of young students, forming the Red Guards, and urged them to attack teachers, government officials, and intellectuals accused of harboring counter-revolutionary ideas. Schools and universities shut down as China descended into a decade of chaos, persecution, and political violence. Over the next 10 years, an estimated 10 million people were killed or driven to suicide, while countless others were imprisoned, tortured, or publicly humiliated. Mao's campaign crippled China's economy, destroyed its cultural heritage, and created lasting scars that the nation would struggle to heal for generations. As Mao tightened his grip on China, those who dared to question his rule or simply belonged to the wrong social class were subjected to relentless persecution. The regime established the Laogai system, a vast network of re-education through labor camps, where millions of political prisoners were sent to endure backbreaking labor under inhumane conditions. Forced to toil in mines, fields, and factories, countless prisoners perished from exhaustion, starvation, or brutal mistreatment. Beyond the camps, Mao's reign of terror extended to the mass execution of so-called class enemies. Landowners, intellectuals, religious leaders, and capitalists were rounded up and condemned as threats to the revolution. Many were subjected to public denunciations and forced to endure struggle sessions, where they were humiliated, beaten, and coerced into confessing to imaginary crimes. For thousands, the final punishment was execution, carried out in public as a warning to others. Fear and suspicion spread across the nation, as no one, regardless of their past loyalty, was safe from the ruthless purges of Mao's regime. At first, Mao Zedong appeared to welcome open debate. In an effort to encourage intellectual discourse, he launched the 100 Flowers campaign, urging scholars, writers, and citizens to freely express their opinions about the government. For a brief moment, many believed China was embracing a new era of openness. However, as criticism of the Communist Party began to mount, Mao abruptly turned against those who spoke out. Branding them as rightists and enemies of the revolution, he launched a ruthless crackdown. Over 550,000 intellectuals, students, and professionals were arrested and imprisoned in labor camps. Many suffered torture, public humiliation, or execution, while others endured years of hard labor and re-education. What began as an invitation for free expression became a calculated trap, reinforcing Mao's absolute control and silencing dissent for years to come. Mao's death and legacy. On September 9, 1976, Mao Zedong passed away at the age of 82, marking the end of an era that had reshaped China through revolution, brutality, and mass suffering. In the aftermath of his death, Deng Xiaoping rose to power, gradually reversing many of Mao's disastrous policies and steering China toward economic reforms that would transform the nation. Despite the immense suffering and loss of over 60 million lives under his rule, Mao remains an officially celebrated figure in China. His image still looms over Tiananmen Square, and his role in founding the People's Republic of China is honored, though the government cautiously refers to his failures as mistakes. Mao's legacy remains deeply controversial, a leader who shaped modern China but at an unimaginable human cost. His rule left a nation both traumatized and transformed, cementing his place as one of history's most ruthless and influential dictators. Idi Amin, Uganda, 1971 to 1979. Born Idi Amin Dada Ume in 1925 in Koboko, Uganda, exact birth date unknown, he came from the Kakwa ethnic group. His father was of Kakwa descent, while his mother was reportedly a witch doctor. His formal education was minimal, limited to a few years in Islamic schools. In 1946, he enlisted in the King's African Rifles, a unit of the British colonial army, initially serving as a cook before transitioning into a combat role. During the British suppression of the Mau Mau Rebellion in Kenya, 1952 to 1960, he gained notoriety for his ruthless tactics. After Uganda gained independence in 1962, Amin quickly climbed the military ranks, becoming one of the few Africans to attain the position of general. By 1966, he had been appointed commander of the armed forces under President Milton Obote. The 1971 coup and rise to power. In January 1971, while President Obote was attending a Commonwealth summit in Singapore, Amin orchestrated a military coup, seizing control of the country. Though he initially pledged to restore democracy, he swiftly consolidated power, proclaiming himself president for life in 1976 and establishing a brutal military dictatorship. Idi Amin's wicked acts. Upon seizing power, Idi Amin unleashed a brutal campaign of executions and purges, targeting anyone he perceived as a threat. His wrath first fell upon supporters of former President Milton Obote, including members of the Echoli, Longi, and Kakwa ethnic groups, whom he viewed with deep suspicion. However, his bloodshed did not stop there. Amin's regime extended its terror to government officials, judges, academics, doctors, teachers, and journalists, silencing all forms of dissent. Even religious leaders who dared to criticize his rule were not spared, their voices crushed under the weight of his tyranny. The methods of execution were gruesome and merciless. Victims were beaten to death, shot, hanged, or hacked apart with machetes. Their bodies were dumped into the Nile River, where they drifted downstream or discovered floating in Lake Victoria, a haunting reminder of Amin's brutality. Elsewhere, mass graves filled with the remains of the executed littered the Ugandan countryside, a grim testament to the hundreds of thousands who perished under his rule. In August 1972, Idi Amin issued a shocking decree. Within 90 days, 80,000 Asians, primarily of Indian and Pakistani descent, were ordered to leave Uganda. For generations, these communities had played a vital role in the nation's economy, dominating trade, banking, and business sectors. Their sudden expulsion sent shockwaves through the country and the world. Amin justified his decision with a bizarre claim. He insisted that God had appeared to him in a dream, commanding him to drive out the Asian population. Whether driven by religious pretense, economic opportunism, or sheer authoritarian impulse, his actions led to economic collapse, as businesses were seized and handed over to inexperienced Ugandans, many of whom struggled to keep them running. The expulsion marked one of the most devastating moments in Uganda's history, forcing an entire community into exile while accelerating the country's economic decline under Amin's erratic and brutal rule. To maintain his grip on power, Idi Amin relied on his notorious secret police, the State Research Bureau, SRB, and the Public Safety Unit to enforce terror and eliminate opposition. These brutal forces operated with absolute impunity, carrying out kidnappings, assassinations, and horrific acts of torture against anyone suspected of disloyalty. One of the most infamous sites of Amin's reign of terror was the Makindye military prison, where prisoners were subjected to unimaginable cruelty. In these dark, blood-stained chambers, victims endured electrocution, castration, and dismemberment at the hands of their captors. Some were skinned alive or burned with acid, their agonizing screams echoing through the prison walls. Others faced a fate even more horrifying, forced to watch their own family members being murdered before meeting the same gruesome end themselves. Under Amin's rule, fear consumed Uganda as no one, not even his closest allies, was safe from the violence and paranoia that defined his brutal dictatorship. Among the many terrifying stories surrounding Idi Amin, some of the most horrifying were the rumors of cannibalism. Whispers circulated that human body parts were stored in his refrigerator, a chilling testament to his appetite for both power and brutality. Defectors and former aides claimed to have witnessed him consuming the livers and hearts of his enemies, solidifying his reputation as a leader driven by bloodlust. Amin himself allegedly boasted about tasting human flesh, once telling his officers, "Human flesh is too salty." Whether these accounts were entirely true or exaggerated, they reflected the deep fear he instilled in those around him. His sadism knew no limits. He reportedly beat and executed people for his own amusement, taking pleasure in their suffering. Perhaps most disturbingly, he sometimes forced the grieving wives of executed men to consume their own husband's flesh, turning their grief into an unimaginable nightmare. These chilling stories, whether fact or legend, cemented Amin's legacy as one of history's most barbaric and feared dictators. As his rule grew more erratic, Idi Amin surrounded himself with grandiose fantasies and absurd titles, declaring himself conqueror of the British Empire in a self-proclaimed act of defiance against Uganda's former colonial rulers. His vanity knew no bounds as he adopted extravagant designations such as Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the sea, and King of Scotland, even going so far as to offer to fight for Scotland's independence despite having no real connection to the country. But Amin's delusions extended beyond mere words. In 1978, he launched a reckless invasion of Tanzania, attempting to seize part of the country. This proved to be his undoing. In April 1979, Tanzanian forces, along with Ugandan rebels, crushed his army, forcing Amin to flee for his life. With his brutal regime finally collapsing, Amin escaped into exile, first finding refuge in Libya, before eventually settling in Saudi Arabia, where he lived out his final years, far from the terror he had inflicted upon Uganda. Despite orchestrating one of the most brutal reigns of terror in Africa's history, Idi Amin never faced justice for his crimes. While the people of Uganda suffered from the scars of his dictatorship, he lived a life of comfort and protection in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, sheltered by the Saudi government. Far from the blood-stained prisons and mass graves he had left behind, Amin spent his final years in luxury and seclusion, evading the consequences of his atrocities. His cruelty remained unpunished, and the voices of his countless victims were denied the justice they deserved. On August 16, 2003, at the age of 78, Amin died of multiple organ failure. There were no grand trials, no reckoning for the horrors he had inflicted. Instead, the dictator, who once ruled through fear and brutality, slipped away in quiet exile, leaving behind a legacy of terror that Uganda would never forget. Saddam Hussein, Iraq, 1979 to 2003. Born on April 28, 1937, in the small village of Al-Auja, near Tikrit, Iraq, Saddam Hussein grew up under the influence of his uncle, a staunch Arab nationalist. From an early age, he was immersed in the ideologies of the Ba'ath Party, which championed Arab unity and resistance against Western influence. This early exposure to political activism shaped his ambitions and ruthless determination. By 1959, Saddam had already made his mark as a young revolutionary, participating in a failed assassination attempt against Iraq's prime minister. The botched plot forced him to flee to Egypt, where he continued his studies in law while remaining deeply involved in Ba'athist politics. His exile was temporary. When the Ba'ath Party briefly seized power in 1963, Saddam returned to Iraq, eager to take part in the new regime. However, political instability led to his imprisonment for conspiracy, an obstacle that would not hold him back for long. In 1966, he escaped, proving his resourcefulness and unwavering drive for power. 2 years later, in 1968, Saddam played a pivotal role in the Ba'ath Party's successful coup, which installed Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr as Iraq's leader. Now firmly entrenched in the inner circle of power, Saddam positioned himself as the regime's enforcer, waiting for the right moment to claim Iraq's leadership for himself. By July 1979, Saddam Hussein had fully consolidated his grip on power. He forced President Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr to resign and immediately declared himself Iraq's new leader. Wasting no time in securing absolute control, he convened a meeting of Ba'ath Party officials, where he accused 68 members of conspiracy. As the room filled with fear, names were read aloud, and one by one, those accused were taken away and executed. It was a chilling display of power, setting the tone for the brutal dictatorship that followed. Saddam ruled through terror and repression, establishing a regime that thrived on fear. Secret police, torture chambers, and mass executions became his primary tools for eliminating dissent. No opposition was tolerated, and anyone who dared to challenge him disappeared or was executed. Saddam Hussein's wicked acts. Among Saddam's most heinous crimes was the Anfal campaign, a genocidal operation targeting Iraq's Kurdish population. Determined to crush Kurdish resistance, he ordered chemical attacks, mass executions, and the destruction of entire villages. One of the most horrifying events occurred on March 16, 1988, in Halabja. In a merciless chemical attack, Iraqi warplanes dropped mustard gas and nerve agents over the Kurdish town. Within moments, 5,000 men, women, and children lay dead, their bodies twisted in agony. Tens of thousands more suffered from lifelong illnesses and deformities, carrying the scars of the attack for generations. The Anfal campaign ultimately claimed the lives of over 100,000 Kurds, leaving behind a trail of devastation, grief, and unspeakable horror. Saddam's use of chemical weapons against his own people cemented his reputation as one of history's most ruthless dictators. Saddam Hussein's grip on Iraq was maintained through a vast and ruthless secret police network, ensuring that no opposition could rise against him. Those who dared to criticize his rule or question his authority faced horrific consequences. His list of victims was extensive. Political dissidents, intellectuals, religious leaders, and even high-ranking military officers were not spared. Loyalty meant nothing, as Saddam often turned on his own family members and Ba'ath Party officials if he suspected betrayal. The methods of torture employed under his regime were unimaginably cruel. Victims were subjected to acid baths, electric shocks, eye gouging, limb amputation, and even being burned alive. Some were thrown into industrial shredders, some feet first while still alive, ensuring maximum suffering. Determined to expand his power, Saddam Hussein launched a devastating war against Iran in 1980, believing he could take advantage of the country's post-revolution instability. Instead, the conflict dragged on for 8 brutal years, leaving behind a trail of death and destruction. Saddam's forces used chemical weapons on both Iranian soldiers and civilians, inflicting unspeakable suffering. By the time the war ended in 1988, between 500,000 and 1 million people had perished, and Iraq was left in economic ruin, yet Saddam refused to relinquish power. Seeking another opportunity to assert dominance, Saddam turned his attention to Kuwait in 1990. In August of that year, he ordered a full-scale invasion, justifying it by claiming that Kuwait historically belonged to Iraq. His forces pillaged the country, set its vast oil fields ablaze, and carried out mass executions, leaving behind devastation. The invasion sparked international outrage. By January 1991, a US-led coalition responded with Operation Desert Storm, delivering a crushing military defeat to Saddam's forces and forcing them to withdraw. In retaliation, Saddam launched SCUD missiles at Israel and Saudi Arabia, attempting to escalate the conflict further. Despite the overwhelming loss, he clung to power, suppressing uprisings and tightening his authoritarian grip on Iraq. Defeat in the Gulf War did not humble Saddam Hussein, it only fueled his vengeance. In 1991, after Shiite Muslims and Marsh Arabs in southern Iraq revolted, he unleashed a merciless crackdown. Thousands were rounded up, executed, and buried in mass graves, while entire villages were razed to the ground. Determined to eradicate the Marsh Arabs' way of life, Saddam drained 90% of the Mesopotamian marshes, transforming the once thriving wetlands into barren wastelands. The survivors were forced into concentration camps, left to endure unimaginable suffering. Even as his grip on Iraq weakened, Saddam continued to defy international pressure. He refused to fully comply with United Nations weapons inspections, fueling suspicions that he was developing weapons of mass destruction, WMDs. The growing tension led to the 2003 US-led invasion of Iraq, justified by concerns over WMDs and Saddam's extensive human rights abuses. Within weeks, his regime collapsed as coalition forces swept through Iraq. On December 13, 2003, the once feared dictator was found cowering in a filthy underground hole near Tikrit. Disheveled and powerless, he was captured without resistance, marking the dramatic end of his brutal reign. Saddam Hussein faced justice in an Iraqi tribunal where he was tried for crimes against humanity. Among his many atrocities, he was found guilty of orchestrating the mass killings in Dujail. 1982. where he had ordered the execution of hundreds in retaliation for an assassination attempt. In November 2006, he was sentenced to death by hanging. Even in his final moments, Saddam remained defiant, mocking his executioners as they prepared the noose. On December 30, 2006, his reign of terror came to an end as he was executed. Kim Il-sung, North Korea, 1948 to 1994. Kim Il-sung was born on April 15, 1912, in Mangyongdae, near Pyongyang, in what was then Japanese-occupied Korea. His family was deeply involved in Korean resistance against Japanese rule, and as a child, he was exposed to nationalist and communist ideologies. In the 1920s, Kim and his family fled to Manchuria, China, where he became involved with communist guerrilla groups fighting against the Japanese occupation. By the 1930s, he had joined the Chinese Communist Party and participated in guerrilla warfare, earning a reputation as a skilled fighter. During World War II, he aligned with the Soviet Union, receiving military training and rising to the rank of major in the Soviet Red Army. As the war ended in 1945, Kim Il-sung was chosen by Joseph Stalin to lead the Soviet-backed regime in North Korea, setting the stage for his decades-long dictatorship. Following Japan's defeat in 1945, Korea was divided, with the Soviet Union controlling the North and the United States overseeing the South. In 1948, the Soviets selected Kim Il-sung to lead North Korea, establishing the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK. He solidified his rule by systematically eliminating rivals through purges and assassinations. On June 25, 1950, Kim Il-sung launched a surprise invasion of South Korea, igniting the Korean War. Confident in support from China and the Soviet Union, he aimed to unify the Korean peninsula under communist rule. However, the invasion prompted a swift response from the United States and United Nations forces, who intervened to defend South Korea. As North Korean forces advanced, they carried out brutal massacres, executing government officials, intellectuals, and civilians suspected of opposing communism. Entire villages were burned to the ground, leaving behind mass graves. The war dragged on for 3 years, causing immense devastation. More than 2.5 million civilians perished, while North Korea alone suffered over 1 million deaths. By the time an armistice was signed in 1953, the country lay in ruins. Yet Kim Il-sung emerged from the conflict more determined than ever to cement his totalitarian rule. After solidifying his rule, Kim Il-sung established a totalitarian dictatorship, where freedom of speech, press, and religion ceased to exist. His control extended to every aspect of life, ensuring absolute obedience from the North Korean people. To reinforce his grip on power, he cultivated a personality cult, portraying himself as a divine leader and the eternal president. His image was everywhere, in homes, schools, workplaces, and even pinned to citizens' clothing. Every day, North Koreans were required to sing songs praising him, bow to his portraits, and memorize his speeches. Dissent was not tolerated. Anyone suspected of disloyalty, no matter how minor, was sent to Kwanliso, the brutal labor camps. Entire families were imprisoned for generations, enduring torture, starvation, and forced labor in conditions few survived. Kim Il-sung's regime operated a vast network of concentration camps, where anyone labeled a political dissident, intellectual, or traitor was sent to endure unimaginable suffering. Under his 3 generations of punishment rule, entire families, grandparents, parents, and children were imprisoned for the alleged crimes of a single relative. Inside these brutal camps, prisoners faced torture, starvation, and relentless forced labor. Executions were commonplace, and women suffered rape and forced abortions at the hands of guards. Newborns born in captivity were immediately killed, ensuring that the traitor's bloodline was erased. Those who survived to tell their stories compared the horrors to Nazi concentration camps, describing malnourished prisoners collapsing from exhaustion, public executions, and beatings so severe that few lived to see freedom again. Kim Il-sung prioritized military expansion and grandiose construction projects, diverting crucial resources away from food production. His policies of forced collectivization stripped farmers of their land and control, leading to widespread food shortages. As agricultural output plummeted, millions of North Koreans faced starvation, a crisis that worsened in the 1990s after his death. The regime responded with harsh punishments. Citizens caught stealing even the smallest amount of food were publicly executed, reinforcing a system where survival itself became an act of defiance. On July 8, 1994, Kim Il-sung died of a heart attack at the age of 82, leaving behind a nation devastated by famine and repression. His death triggered a carefully orchestrated period of national mourning, with citizens expected to grieve publicly or risk punishment. Despite his brutal rule, the North Korean government deified him, granting him the eternal title of Eternal President and preserving his embalmed body in the Kumsusan Palace of the Sun. His son, Kim Jong-il, immediately took power, ensuring that the dictatorship and the oppressive legacy of his father would continue.